Why is this the world's greatest paradox? A continent overflowing with unimaginable wealth, gold, diamonds, oil, the very minerals that power our modern world, yet remains the least developed. How did Asia, Europe, the Americas, how did they sprint ahead while Africa, a cradle of humanity and home to some of history's most magnificent empires, was left behind? It was not always this way. There was a time when African kings controlled global gold supplies, when their cities were centers of learning and their artisans produced works of breathtaking beauty. So what happened? What cataclysmic series of events shattered this trajectory and systematically dismantled its potential for centuries? This is not a story of a continent that failed. This is the story of a continent that was failed. This documentary will journey through time to uncover the brutal, calculated, and deliberate process of how Africa was actively underdeveloped. We will expose the greatest theft in human history and answer the question, how did Africa come to be where it is today? Part 1. The Age of Gold and Kingdoms, CE 800–1400. Long before the first European ships appeared on the horizon, Africa was a continent of legends. Its wealth was so immense it was the stuff of myth in markets across Europe and the Middle East. This was not a land waiting to be discovered. It was a land that controlled the very lifeblood of the medieval global economy, gold. Our story begins not with weakness, but with unparalleled power. In West Africa, between the 8th and 11th centuries, the Ghana Empire reigned supreme. Its king commanded an army of 200,000 warriors, a force that would have dwarfed any in contemporary Europe. But his true power lay not in soldiers, but in trade. Ghana was the land of gold, controlling the routes that brought the precious metal from mines in the south to the Mediterranean world in the north. So vast was its supply that the king alone was permitted to own gold nuggets, ensuring its value remained legendary. But Ghana was only the beginning. Its successor, the Mali Empire, would achieve a level of fame that stunned the known world. In the year 1324, Emperor Mansa Musa embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca. This was not a humble journey. His caravan was a moving city, tens of thousands of soldiers, officials, and slaves, preceded by 500 slaves, each carrying a staff of solid gold. He brought so much gold to Cairo that he spent and gifted it with such abandon that he caused rampant inflation, crashing the local economy for over a decade. Mansa Musa was, by any modern calculation, the richest person in human history, and he was an African king. This wealth was not just for show. It funded centers of learning that became the envy of the world. In the city of Timbuktu, the University of Sankore attracted scholars from across Africa and the Middle East. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on law, medicine, astronomy, and history. Meanwhile, far to the east, in what is now Nigeria, the Kingdom of Benin was perfecting the art of bronze casting, creating sculptures of such exquisite detail and naturalism that European visitors centuries later would assume they must have been made with the help of Portuguese craftsmen. They were wrong. This was a uniquely African genius. And in the south, the stone city of Great Zimbabwe stood as a monumental testament to engineering and statecraft. its towering walls constructed without a single drop of mortar, yet enduring for centuries. This was the Africa that the outside world first sought out not to conquer, but to trade with. A continent of powerful, organized, and sophisticated empires connected to global networks of commerce and knowledge. They were not lagging behind. They were on their own formidable paths of development. But a storm was gathering far out at sea, a storm that would use Africa's own wealth against it and would forever shatter this golden age.
Part 2. From Trade to Trauma. The Corruption of a Relationship. 1440s to 1700s. The first European ships to arrive on African shores did not come with cannons blazing. They came as supplicants, not masters. In the 1440s, when Portuguese explorers first made contact with the powerful kingdoms of West Africa, they encountered a world they could not dominate. They found sophisticated states with powerful armies and established trading networks that stretched across the Sahara. The Europeans were often weak, disease-ridden, and entirely dependent on the goodwill of African kings for permission to even land on their shores. The initial trade was, for the most part, on African terms. The Europeans desperately sought gold, ivory, and pepper, commodities that African kingdoms controlled. In return, they offered goods that were novel to Africans: brass, copper, textiles, and later, firearms. For decades, this was a relationship of mutual, if cautious, interest. African elites enhanced their prestige and power with new luxury goods, while Europeans got a foothold in the continent's legendary wealth. But this balance of power was fragile, and the Europeans began to systematically dismantle it. The first weapon was not a gun, but a pen and a papal decree. In 1455, Pope Nicholas V granted Portugal the right to conquer and enslave pagans, providing a religious and legal justification for their actions. Alongside this, they introduced complex treaties of friendship and trade, which were often deliberately mistranslated. An African king might be signing an agreement for exclusive trade rights, believing he was strengthening his position against a rival. In reality, he was often signing away his sovereignty, ceding land, or granting Europeans the right to settle and build forts like those at Arguim and Elmina. This was the beginning of the diplomatic trickery that would slowly erode African autonomy. The most devastating strategy, however, was the deliberate manipulation of Africa's political landscape through the introduction of firearms. European traders realized that the easiest way to acquire the captives they needed for the burgeoning transatlantic slave trade was not through their own direct raids, but by fueling wars between African states. They would provide one kingdom with advanced firearms, guns, powder, and cannons on credit, to be paid for in captives from their enemies. This created a vicious cycle. To pay off their debt and maintain their new military advantage, a kingdom had to go to war to capture more people. To protect themselves from their now armed rivals, neighboring kingdoms had no choice but to also seek European weapons, plunging themselves into the same cycle of violence and debt. This strategic corruption of existing rivalries systematically destabilized the entire region. What began as trade between relative equals had been utterly corrupted. The demand for human beings on plantations in the Americas had turned European traders from business partners into predators. The first captives sold to the Portuguese in the 1440s were a trickle, but it soon grew into the largest forced migration in human history. An estimated 12.5 million Africans were captured and shipped across the Atlantic, with about 10.7 million surviving the horrific Middle Passage. The continent was being bled of its most vital resource, its people, to build the economies of the New World. The greatest human drain in history had begun, and it would bleed Africa for the next 4 centuries, fundamentally crippling its demographic and economic trajectory. Part 3. The Carving and the Conquest, 1884 to 1900. By the late 19th century, the relationship between Europe and Africa had been defined by the slave trade for 400 years. But a new hunger was emerging in Europe, an insatiable demand for the industrial raw materials that fueled its factories: rubber, palm oil, copper, and diamonds. The informal influence and coastal forts were no longer enough. The continent's vast interior, with its untapped wealth, was the final prize. And so, in 1884, the world watched as the most audacious act of geopolitical theft in history unfolded not on a battlefield, but in a finely appointed drawing room in Berlin, Germany. At the invitation of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the powers of Europe, including Britain, France, Portugal, and a newly unified Germany, gathered to decide the fate of a continent. There was one group conspicuously absent from the negotiations: any African leader. For months, the European diplomats haggled over spheres of influence, trading territories and drawing straight, arbitrary lines on a map that meant nothing to the millions of people who lived there. By 1885, the scramble for Africa was complete. The continent had been carved up like a cake, its destiny sealed by men who had never set foot there. But a line on a map is one thing. Enforcing it is another. What followed was the pacification, a chilling euphemism for a campaign of brutal military conquest. The technological gap that had been widening for centuries was now a chasm. African warriors, armed with courage, spears, and outdated muskets, faced the industrial-era firepower of Europe. The most symbolic weapon of this era was the Maxim gun, the world's first recoil-operated machine gun. As the saying chillingly went, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not." It was a weapon of terror and mass slaughter, capable of mowing down hundreds of charging warriors in minutes. The outcome of battles was no longer in doubt. They were massacres. Yet, to claim Africans did not fight back is a lie. They resisted with incredible bravery, but they were fighting against the very tide of industrial history.
In West Africa, the Mandinkan Empire, led by the brilliant strategist Samori Touré, fought the French for nearly 2 decades, from 1882 to 1898, using sophisticated tactics and even manufacturing his own rifles. He was only defeated after being surrounded and captured. In southern Africa, the Ndebele and Shona peoples launched a massive uprising against the British South Africa Company in 1896-97 in a conflict known as the First Chimerenda. It was crushed with overwhelming force. In the Congo, the forces of King Mayonza of the Sangha fought the Belgian King Leopold II's brutal regime, which was not a state conquest, but a personal corporate plunder of rubber and ivory that cost millions of lives. By the dawn of the 20th century, it was over. With the exception of Ethiopia, which stunningly defeated an Italian invasion at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, and Liberia, the entire continent of Africa was under European colonial rule. The kingdoms and empires of old were gone, swallowed by new artificial constructs called Nigeria, Gold Coast, French West Africa, and German East Africa. The conquest was complete. The era of exploitation could now begin in earnest, and the underdevelopment of Africa would become a formal, state-sponsored project. Part 4. The Colonial Machine, 1900 to 1957. The flags had been raised, the borders drawn, but the true work of colonialism was just beginning. Conquest was not the end goal, extraction was. The period from 1900 onward saw the creation of a vast, continent-wide machine meticulously designed for a single purpose: to transfer the wealth of Africa to Europe as efficiently and cheaply as possible. This was the colonial economy, and it would rewire the continent's entire economic DNA to serve its masters. The first tool of this machine was infrastructure, but infrastructure meant to build a nation. Every railway, every road, every port built by the colonial powers had one destination: outward. Railways snaked from copper mines in the Belgian Congo to the Atlantic, from gold mines in the Gold Coast to the sea. There were no lines built to connect neighboring African cities or to foster trade between colonies. The entire transport system was designed like a spider's web, funneling raw resources to the coastal ports where they could be shipped to European factories. This deliberate design stifled the development of internal markets and ensured African economies could not integrate or support each other. At the same time, African agriculture was violently repurposed. Subsistence farming, which had fed local populations for millennia, was often banned or heavily taxed. Instead, farmers were forced by law to grow cash crops for European industries: cotton in French West Africa, cocoa in the Gold Coast, peanuts in Senegal. The best land was taken for these plantations, and African farmers were turned into laborers on their own soil, producing what they did not consume and consuming what they did not produce. This made entire regions dangerously dependent on one commodity, whose price was set in London or Paris. When global prices crashed, as they did during the Great Depression, famine stalked the lands of those who grew food for the world but were forbidden from growing it for themselves. Politically, the system was built on a foundation of racial segregation and deliberate undereducation. The British ruled through indirect rule, propping up compliant local chiefs and freezing traditional political systems in time, stripping them of their dynamism. The French pursued a policy of assimilation, offering a tiny elite the promise of French citizenship if they adopted French culture entirely, effectively teaching them to be ashamed of their own heritage. But for the most part, education was deliberately neglected. The mission was to create a supply of cheap labor, not a class of engineers, doctors, or economists. As a British official in northern Nigeria famously stated, the goal was to teach the native to use a plow, not to give him a literary education. By the mid-20th century, the machine was running at full capacity. Africa was producing a staggering portion of the world's diamonds, cobalt, rubber, and cocoa. But this wealth flowed in one direction only: out. The colonies were left with no industrial base, no skilled workforce, and economies that were utterly lopsided and dependent. They were producers of raw materials forever tied to the whims of their colonial masters. When the winds of change finally brought independence, the new African nations would not inherit thriving, diversified economies. They would inherit the hollowed-out shell of the colonial machine, a poisoned chalice that would define their struggles for decades to come. Part 5. The Bitter Fruit of Independence, 1957, present. The mid-20th century brought a long-awaited dawn. From the Gold Coast's transformation into Ghana in 1957 to Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, and a cascade of nations following suit, the colonial flags were lowered. After decades of struggle, Africa was free, its people filled with a soaring, palpable hope. The great project of nation-building could finally begin. But this freedom came with a crushing inheritance. The new leaders stepped into offices that were structurally designed for failure. They had won the political kingdom, but the economic kingdom remained firmly in foreign hands. The first poison pill was the political system. The arbitrary borders drawn in Berlin in 1885 now became the borders of new nations. These lines grouped rival ethnic groups together and split unified peoples apart, creating a tinderbox of internal conflict. The first major crisis erupted in the Congo immediately after its 1960 independence, when the province of Katanga, rich in minerals, seceded with the backing of foreign mining interests. The country's first democratically elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, was overthrown and assassinated in 1961 with the complicity of foreign powers, setting a tragic precedent that political leaders who challenged Western interests would not survive. This instability paved the way for military strongmen and one-party states, both pro-Western and socialist, who often ruled with an iron fist, arguing that tribalism made democracy a luxury Africa could not afford. Economically, the trap was even more insidious. The new nations inherited economies that were monocultures, dependent on a single export, like Zambian copper or Ghanaian cocoa. When global prices for these commodities fell, their economies collapsed. To survive, they were forced to borrow billions from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. In the 1980s and 90s, these institutions imposed structural adjustment programs, SAPs as a condition for loans. The terms were devastating. Slash spending on health and education, privatize state-owned industries, and devalue currencies to make exports cheaper. In practice, this meant the collapse of public services, the layoff of thousands of civil servants, and the fire sale of national assets to foreign corporations. The state, the one instrument that could guide development, was systematically dismantled. The debt used to control them ballooned, with Africa paying more in debt servicing back to the rich world than it received in aid, a net outflow of wealth that continues to this day. This toxic mix of political instability and economic crisis gave rise to the resource curse. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo were blessed with immense oil and mineral wealth, but this wealth became a curse. It fueled corruption on an epic scale, as elites fought to control the revenue streams, often depositing the money in foreign banks. It funded brutal civil wars over conflict minerals like diamonds and coltan, and it created rentier states where governments were accountable not to their people, but to the foreign companies that paid for the resources. The legacy of this poisoned chalice is the Africa of today, a continent of breathtaking contradictions. It is a place of resilient, innovative, and youthful populations driving a digital revolution in places like Kenya's Silicon Savannah. Yet it is still grappling with the deep structural wounds inflicted by the colonial machine and the dysfunctional systems it left behind. The story of modern Africa is not one of a failed continent, but one of a continent struggling to overcome a history of being deliberately and systematically underdeveloped. The path forward is being forged not in the halls of power alone, but in the tech hubs, markets, and villages, where a new generation is finally seizing the reins of its own destiny, battling the long shadow of a history that was never of its own making. The story of how Africa came to be perceived as the world's least advanced continent is not a simple story of geographic destiny or of a people left behind by time. It is a far more complex and deliberate story. It is the story of a vibrant tapestry of powerful kingdoms and rich cultures. It is the story of that tapestry being systematically torn apart, first by the catastrophic human drain of the slave trade, which destabilized societies for centuries. Then, by the cynical carving of the continent into artificial states at the Berlin Conference, designed not for governance, but for exploitation. And finally, by the relentless machinery of colonialism, which built an economic model whose sole purpose was extraction, leaving behind nations with no industrial base, crippling debt, and borders that bred conflict. The challenges of modern Africa, political instability, economic dependency, the resource curse, are not the cause of its situation. They are the symptoms, the bitter fruit of this long and calculated process of underdevelopment. But as we have seen, this is not where the story ends. Across the continent today, a new dawn is breaking. A generation of innovators, artists, entrepreneurs, and activists is rising, not to forget the past, but to overcome it. They are building a new future on their own terms, reclaiming a narrative that was stolen from them centuries ago. The question is no longer what was done to Africa, but what Africa is now doing for itself. We sincerely thank you for joining us on this profound and necessary journey through the history of a continent. If this documentary has changed your perspective, Please support our mission to bring you more untold stories and transformative histories. Subscribe to Narrated History and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the events and figures that shaped our world.